On this day, a little blonde-haired girl caught the Führer's eye. Her mother told Hitler it was also her daughter's 6th birthday, where Hitler and the girl were photographed together by his photographer Heinrich Hoffmann.
April 20th, 1933. A 6-year-old blonde girl stood at the gates of Adolf Hitler's Bavarian residence, celebrating her birthday on the exact same day as Germany's new Chancellor. What happened next would become one of the most puzzling relationships in Nazi history. Hitler invited the child and her mother inside. Photographs were taken. A friendship began that would last 5 years and confuse historians for decades. But there was a problem that would horrify Hitler's inner circle and contradict everything the Nazi regime represented. The little girl, who became known as the Führer's child, had Jewish ancestry, and Hitler knew about it from the very beginning. For years, their friendship continued despite the Nuremberg laws, despite his advisor's alarm, despite the ideology Hitler himself was building. But in 1938, it ended abruptly. The question that still puzzles everyone: why did Hitler maintain this relationship at all? And what finally forced him to let her go? On the 20th of April 1933, Adolf Hitler had been Germany's Chancellor for just 4 months. He marked his 44th birthday the way he usually did, emerging from his Bavarian home, Haus Wachenfeld, perched above Salzburg. Well-wishers and supporters had gathered near the security gates, hoping to catch a glimpse of Germany's new leader. Security around the property was still relatively relaxed. This was before the house would be rebuilt into the famous Berghof 2 years later, before the tight security protocols that would make Hitler nearly inaccessible. For now, the public could still get reasonably close. Among the crowd that day was a young mother with her blonde-haired daughter. The little girl caught Hitler's attention immediately. When the mother mentioned that her daughter was also celebrating her 6th birthday that very day, Hitler became captivated. The coincidence, combined with the child's appearance, seemed to fascinate him in a way that went beyond his usual interactions with children. Hitler extended an invitation that would set the stage for one of history's strangest relationships. He asked the mother and daughter to accompany him back to his residence. Once inside, Hitler's personal photographer, Heinrich Hoffmann, captured images of the dictator and the young girl together. These photographs would become the first of many. The atmosphere inside Haus Wachenfeld that day must have felt surreal for Carolina and her daughter. Here they were, ordinary citizens from Munich, suddenly guests in the private residence of Germany's most powerful man. Hitler, by numerous accounts, could be charming when he chose to be, particularly with children. He often used these interactions to craft his public image as a caring leader who loved Germany's youth. But this encounter seemed different from the start. There was something about this particular child, this specific coincidence of shared birthdays, that captured his attention in an unusual way. The photographs Hoffmann took that day show Hitler genuinely engaged, not simply posing for propaganda purposes. The friendship that began that day would endure until 1938, but it carried a secret that would deeply trouble Hitler's most trusted advisors. This wasn't just another photo opportunity with the children of Nazi officials or household staff. This little girl was different in a way that contradicted everything the Nazi regime claimed to stand for. Her name was Bernhild Nino, though she'd come to be known affectionately as Bernila, and she carried a heritage that, under the very laws Hitler would soon enforce, made her racially impure in the eyes of the state he was building. But before understanding why this friendship was so problematic, we need to understand who this little girl really was and how her family's history would collide with Nazi ideology. Bernhild Nino was born in 1926 to Dr. Bernhard Nino, a physician from Dortmund, and his wife Carolina, who worked as a nurse. Tragedy struck the family early when Dr. Nino passed away shortly after his daughter's birth, leaving Carolina to raise Bernhild alone. In 1928, Carolina made a decision that would change their lives. She relocated to Munich, bringing her own mother along to help raise Bernhild. It was this move that would eventually lead to the fateful birthday encounter with Hitler 5 years later. But it was also Carolina's mother who carried the secret that would later cause such concern among Nazi leadership. Carolina's mother, Eva Voigt, was a retired teacher and a devoted Roman Catholic. On the surface, she appeared to be exactly the kind of German citizen the Nazis would approve of. But Eva had been born into a Jewish family. Her maiden name was Morgenstern, and by birth, she was Jewish. Under the Nazi racial laws that would take effect in 1935, 2 years after Bernhild's first meeting with Hitler, this heritage would have devastating implications. The Nazis didn't view Judaism as simply a religion that could be abandoned through conversion. They defined it as a race, something inherent and unchangeable in a person's bloodline. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 introduced complex and intricate classifications based on the percentage of Jewish ancestry. These laws determined who counted as a German citizen and who was considered an outsider, subject to exclusion, persecution, and worse. The system created categories based on how many Jewish grandparents a person had, with each category carrying different rights and restrictions. The laws were deliberately complicated, creating a bureaucratic nightmare that could be manipulated to serve Nazi purposes. People had to prove their ancestry going back generations, producing birth certificates, marriage licenses, and baptismal records. Entire government offices were established just to process these racial classifications. The complexity served a purpose. It gave the regime flexibility to persecute whoever they wanted while maintaining a veneer of legality. Families were torn apart by these classifications. Siblings could fall into different categories depending on whom they married. Children could be classified differently than their parents. The arbitrary nature of the percentages, the idea that being 1/8 Jewish was fundamentally different from being 1/16 Jewish, revealed the pseudo-scientific absurdity underlying the entire system. Under these rules, Eva Voigt, having been born to Jewish parents, would be classified as fully Jewish. This classification would strip her of German citizenship entirely, regardless of her conversion to Catholicism years earlier. The Nazis had decided that Jews who converted to other religions were still Jews because, in their ideology, Judaism was racial rather than religious. Anyone born to Jewish parents remained Jewish in their eyes, no matter what they believed or practiced. This created a cascading problem for the rest of the family. Carolina, Eva's daughter, fell into what the Nazis termed mixed race of the first degree. This meant she was classified as half Jewish. Under the law from 1935 onward, Carolina was considered to only partly belong to the German race and nation, though she could technically still hold Reich citizenship under certain conditions. And this brought us to the real problem: Bernhild herself. As Carolina's daughter, Bernhild inherited 1/4 Jewish ancestry. This placed her in the category of mixed race of the second degree. Like her mother, she was considered to only partly belong to the German race and nation, though she too maintained Reich citizenship status. Technically, legally, Bernhild was an approved citizen, but there was a massive gap between legal approval and social acceptance in Nazi Germany. For the Führer himself to be publicly associated with a child who was 1/4 Jewish by descent caused alarm bells to ring throughout the Nazi leadership. The optics were terrible. Here was the man building an ideology of racial purity, maintaining a personal friendship with a child his own laws deemed racially impure. But here's what makes this story even more puzzling. Hitler knew about Bernhild's Jewish ancestry from the very beginning, informed about it in 1933, the same year they met, and yet the friendship continued. Throughout the 1930s, Hitler and Bernhild continued to meet occasionally. These weren't secret encounters hidden from public view, quite the opposite. Heinrich Hoffmann, Hitler's official photographer, had published numerous photographs of Hitler and Bernhild together, and these images proved remarkably popular with the German public. The photographs attracted significant public interest and attention. People found something touching about the Führer spending time with this young girl. She became known by a nickname that would later seem deeply ironic, the Führer's child. German citizens saw these images as evidence of Hitler's softer, more human side. They had no idea about the heritage that made this friendship so contradictory. Between 1935 and 1939, Bernhild sent at least 17 letters to Wilhelm Bruckner, Hitler's chief adjutant and an SS officer. This correspondence suggests a relationship that went beyond occasional photo opportunities. There was genuine, ongoing contact between the Führer's office and this young girl. Hitler was frequently photographed and filmed with children. His longtime companion Eva Braun captured many such encounters on her home movie camera. But those children were almost exclusively the sons and daughters of high-ranking Nazi officials, particularly the children of Martin Bormann and Joseph Goebbels, or the children of Hitler's household staff. These were safe, ideologically appropriate relationships that reinforced the image of a leader surrounded by the next generation of pure Germans. The images that Hoffmann distributed showed Hitler in various informal settings with Bernhild. Sometimes they appeared at the Berghof, sometimes during outdoor walks in the Bavarian mountains. The photographs were carefully crafted to show Hitler as approachable and kind, a leader who cared deeply about Germany's children. German newspapers and magazines published these images regularly throughout the mid-1930s. They appeared in photo books and propaganda materials celebrating Hitler's connection to ordinary Germans. For the regime's purposes, these images were perfect propaganda, showing a softer side of their leader. What made them dangerous was the secret they contained, a secret known only to Hitler's inner circle. The very child being used to humanize Hitler was classified under his own laws as racially impure. Bernhild was neither. She wasn't the daughter of a Nazi official. She wasn't part of the household staff. And most critically, she wasn't racially pure, according to the very standards Hitler's regime had established. The situation became increasingly untenable as the 1930s progressed, and Nazi racial policies grew more rigid and more brutal. The Nuremberg laws that had been theoretical in 1935 were now being enforced with increasing severity. The regime that had once simply categorized people was now actively persecuting them. And still, the photographs kept coming. Hoffmann continued publishing official images of Hitler and Bernhild together, distributed to newspapers and magazines across Germany. Each publication was another reminder of this inexplicable relationship. This is where Martin Bormann enters the story, and where the friendship would finally meet its end. Martin Bormann was Hitler's private secretary, but that title doesn't fully capture his power. Bormann controlled access to Hitler, managed his schedule, and had enormous influence over what information reached the Führer and what didn't. He was fiercely protective of Hitler's image and obsessively concerned with maintaining ideological purity in all things related to the Nazi leadership. When Bormann became fully aware of Brunhild's Jewish ancestry and the ongoing nature of Hitler's friendship with her, he took immediate action. This wasn't something that could continue. The optics were too damaging, the contradiction too obvious. Despite any personal feelings Hitler might have had, this relationship posed a serious problem for the regime's credibility. Bormann personally contacted Carolina, Brunhild's mother. The message was direct and unmistakable. She was to stop bringing the child to the Berghof, as Hitler's rebuilt and expanded residence was now called. The friendship was over, by order of the Nazi hierarchy. But Heinrich Hoffmann, Hitler's photographer who had captured so many images of Hitler and Brunhild over the years, didn't immediately comply with this new directive. He continued to publish photographs of the two together, perhaps not understanding how serious Bormann was about ending this association, or perhaps believing Hitler's personal wishes outweighed Bormann's concerns. Bormann's intervention wasn't just about protecting Hitler's image. By 1938, the Nazi regime was accelerating its persecution of Jews and anyone with Jewish ancestry. The Anschluss with Austria had just occurred in March. Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, would happen in November. The regime was moving from bureaucratic persecution to open violence. In this climate, Hitler's continued association with a girl classified as one-quarter Jewish was more than just an embarrassing contradiction. It was potentially dangerous to the regime's credibility as it ramped up its anti-Semitic violence. Bormann understood this in a way that perhaps Hitler, isolated in his mountain retreat and surrounded by loyalists, did not. The private secretary saw the bigger picture and acted accordingly. The situation came to a head in May 1938. Carolina received an official notification, this time leaving no room for interpretation or defiance. She was instructed to cease all contact with high-ranking party officials. This wasn't a suggestion from Bormann anymore. This was an official order from the Nazi Party apparatus. The friendship that had begun 5 years earlier on that shared birthday was now officially terminated. Brunhild, who had become known as the Führer's child, was no longer welcome in Hitler's presence. The photographs that had been so popular with the German public would no longer be taken. The letters to Wilhelm Brückner would stop. According to Hoffmann's later recollections, Hitler was genuinely upset about Bormann's intervention. The photographer remembered Hitler expressing frustration with his private secretary, complaining that there were people who seemed to have a special talent for ruining all his small pleasures. This wasn't the reaction of someone who had simply been using a child for propaganda purposes. Hitler appeared to have formed some kind of actual attachment to Brunhild, and this is what makes the entire story so puzzling and so disturbing. Hitler knew about Brunhild's Jewish ancestry from 1933. He knew what his own racial laws said about people with her heritage. He knew the persecution his regime was inflicting on Jews and anyone with Jewish ancestry. And yet he maintained this friendship until his own staff forced him to end it. Historians and psychologists have spent decades trying to understand Hitler's motivations. Why would the architect of the Holocaust maintain a personal relationship with a child his own ideology deemed inferior? Various explanations have been proposed, ranging from cognitive dissonance to compartmentalization to some form of personal exemption Hitler granted in his own mind. The honest answer is that nobody really knows. Perhaps Hitler, despite his monstrous ideology and actions, was capable of forming individual attachments that contradicted his broader beliefs. Perhaps he saw Brunhild as somehow different, an exception to the rules he applied to everyone else. Perhaps he simply didn't think about the contradiction at all, keeping these two parts of his life mentally separate. What we do know is that his personal feelings, whatever they were, didn't change anything about Nazi policy or save anyone from persecution. The regime continued its increasingly violent campaign against Jews and anyone with Jewish ancestry. The laws remained. The persecution intensified. One little girl's friendship with Hitler didn't soften his ideology or slow the machinery of genocide he was building. And ultimately, even that friendship wasn't allowed to continue once Borman decided it was too problematic to maintain. After 1938, Bernhild's story became one of loss and tragedy, much like millions of other stories from that dark period in history. The girl who had once been photographed with Hitler, who had sent letters to his office, who had been called the Führer's child by adoring Germans, now lived in a country that officially considered her racially impure. Eva Voigt, Bernhild's grandmother, and the source of the Jewish ancestry that had caused so much concern, died in 1942. She passed away without any money, having lived through years of increasing persecution and restrictions under the Nazi regime. Her conversion to Catholicism decades earlier had meant nothing. Her lifetime as a German teacher had meant nothing. The Nazis had classified her as Jewish, and that classification determined everything about how she lived and how she died. Carolina, Bernhild's mother, managed to survive the entire war despite her classification as first-degree mixed race. How she navigated those dangerous years, what compromises she had to make, what persecution she faced, we don't know in detail. But she survived, living until 1962 in a very different Germany than the one she had known in the 1930s. The survival of people classified as Mischlinge, mixed race, varied greatly depending on numerous factors: where they lived, whether they had connections, whether they kept their heads down, and often simply luck. Some were deported to concentration camps. Others were subjected to forced sterilization. Many lost their jobs and were forbidden from attending universities. Carolina's survival through all of this, while her mother died in poverty and while the regime murdered 6 million Jews, speaks to both the arbitrary cruelty and the strange inconsistencies of Nazi racial policy. Her earlier connection to Hitler may have provided some protection, or it may have meant nothing at all. We simply don't know. But Bernhild herself was not so fortunate. In 1943, at just 17 years old, she died of spinal polio in a Munich hospital. The little blonde girl, who had celebrated her 6th birthday with Adolf Hitler, was gone, her life cut short, not by Nazi persecution, but by disease. She was laid to rest in Munich's West Cemetery, her brief life a strange footnote in the horrific history of Nazi Germany. It's impossible not to wonder what Bernhild's life might have been like if she had lived. She would have been 22 when the war ended, old enough to understand the full scope of what had happened in Germany, old enough to process what her childhood friendship with Hitler really meant. She would have grown up knowing that the man who had once been kind to her, who had posed for photographs with her, who had seemed upset when their friendship was ended, was the same man who orchestrated the murder of millions, including many people who shared her grandmother's heritage. The story of Hitler and his so-called Jewish daughter raises uncomfortable questions about human nature, about how people compartmentalize, about how personal relationships exist alongside monstrous ideology. It doesn't redeem Hitler in any way. It doesn't suggest he had a good side that balanced out his evil. If anything, it makes him more disturbing, not less. The capacity to be kind to one child while orchestrating genocide against millions reveals something deeply broken in human psychology. Bernhild Nino's story reminds us that the people caught up in history's worst moments were individuals with their own stories, their own relationships, their own brief moments of happiness before everything fell apart. She was a little girl who happened to be born on the same day as a dictator, whose Jewish grandmother made her an ideological problem, whose short life intersected with one of history's darkest periods in the most bizarre way possible. And in the end, despite that strange friendship, despite the photographs and the letters and Hitler's apparent fondness for her, none of it protected her or her family. Her grandmother died poor and persecuted. She herself died young, her life cut short before she could fully understand her own place in this strange historical footnote. The friendship that had seemed so significant, that had caused such concern among Nazi leadership, that had puzzled historians for decades, ultimately meant nothing in the face of the larger horrors unfolding around it.